uniformly, people were concerned about the way the redistricting process affected the way democracy works in Pennsylvania. That is, they were concerned that the current redistricting process created difficulties for voters, created difficulties for candidates, and really depressed both turnout but also increased the mistrust of the legislature over the long term. So we heard a lot of those sorts of statements from people who engaged us in the public hearings.
From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy on the campus of Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Chris Beam.
And I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works.
Who's with us today, Jenna?
Today we are talking with our colleague here at Penn State, Leanne Banaszak, who is also a member of the Pennsylvania Redistricting Reform Commission, a group that is looking at redistricting in Pennsylvania. It was formed following a Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision in 2018 that gave the state a new map, and the governor's office is seeking to perhaps make some changes to the way that Pennsylvania's map is drawn in advance of the next census and the next map drawing in 2021.
Yeah, perhaps we should start by just talking about how Pennsylvania's maps are actually drawn. There's really two maps, aren't there, Chris?
Yeah, there's one for the legislature, a state legislature, and then one for the congressional district.
Yeah, we have a kind of strange procedure here where they
But that's so unusual for Pennsylvania to have a strange procedure.
They do each one differently. So the congressional map, which was the subject of a recent Pennsylvania State Supreme Court decision.
Right. Because of suits brought by private agencies saying that the extant map was unconstitutional in terms of the state constitution.
Right, and too partisan. And then the state legislative map is drawn through a commission of basically partisan members.
Well, and there's one nonpartisan one, right?
But other than that, it's leaders of the legislature and Supreme Court judges. And this is why the Supreme Court gets to pick people for it, too. And this is why the election of some Democrats in a recent state Supreme Court election was so important.
Right, and it's
contested for that.
And it also speaks to the fact that gerrymandering is often not so much about, it's not merely about partisan advantage, it's also about defending incumbency.
Right.
And so there are plenty of Democrats who said, fine, as long as I get my seat safe, you do what you want, because I know I'm not going to be in the majority anyway.
Right.
But all right. But we need to talk about how relevant this is.
It is, but I think the state context is important because it's the state context that led to this. I mean, it was the fact that that having a map imposed by the courts was not well received, and that
you mean within the state.
Within the state. Mm-hmm. And that there was recognition that the system for drawing maps is flawed, and so they need to find a new one.
Yes. And the other reason it's relevant is that as after this most recent Supreme Court decision, the states is all we have left. Any advocate has left as a strategy.
Right. Well, we're basically at the status quo ante on these court decisions because there was some thought that perhaps the courts were going to step in and say that all the redistricting that's been going on is unconstitutional for some reason or another, having to do with partisan advantages.
And have some kind of objective standard that they could apply that would allow them to say yes or no.
Right, but the court said we're not going to do this.
Right.
Unless it has to do with race, we're not going to do this. And so we're essentially where we were beforehand, which is that the locus of activity for what goes on in redistricting is in the states.
Right. And it's also important to note that while most states have these lines drawn in the legislature and signed by the governor, there are other states that have different nonpartisan or at least less partisan mechanisms for drawing the
right. And so as I understand it, the question that Governor Wolf put to his commission that he set up, that Leanne is a member of, was figure out, looking at what other states are doing, considering what the residents of Pennsylvania want to do, let's come up with a better system.
Right. What Leanne says about that, I think, is really interesting.
Right, that people come in and they're not even just making public statements like you might see at a town hall meeting, but rather that they're invited to sit with members of the commission and to discuss. And the commission is a cross section of smart people and involved people in Pennsylvania.
I think that's a good table setting, both with respect to this issue of redistricting and gerrymandering, and also what the commission was out to do. So why don't we bring her in?
This is Jenna Spinelli here today with Leanne Banaszak. Leanne, thanks for joining us on Democracy Works.
My pleasure.
So we are talking today about redistricting and gerrymandering, the thorniest problems of democracy that we're facing today. And it's one of those things, every state does things a little bit differently. We've heard a lot recently about North Carolina and Wisconsin and Maryland. We'll maybe talk about the kind of different models in different states later. But you have, over the past year or so, been working on a commission specifically focused on Pennsylvania. So can you give us a lay of the land of what the redistricting landscape is in Pennsylvania and where this commission fits into that mix?
So I'm part of a commission appointed by the governor to make recommendations on how to reform the redistricting process. Obviously, in Pennsylvania, that's become a very salient question, in large part because we had the Pennsylvania Supreme Court step in and redistrict over the process as a result of some suits that were filed, and also because we had in the last redistricting process some districts that very famously appear on the web. I think one of the biggest hits has been the Donald Duck kicking Goofy district, right? And so the governor appointed this commission to really explore ways that the process could be altered.
So this seems like something of an obvious question, but I think it's worth discussing, even if briefly. Why is redistricting important to democracy?
Well, so obviously, in our electoral system, we elect people via a process of voters in a district vote for one person in that district, right? And so in the course of setting up those districts, you can determine a lot of how that legislature looks. And so many of the people who have come to the public hearings talk about the fact that in the case of redistricting as it is now in Pennsylvania, what you have are the people who are being elected selecting their voters instead of voters selecting who's going to represent them. And so the issue is one really of how of representation on the one hand, and also of kind of the democratic process. So who's making the decision?
Sure. And there's several factors that go into how a district is drawn or should be drawn. Things like compactness, keeping communities of interest together. Can you walk us through what some of those factors are?
Sure. So obviously the one that most people think about is equal population, and that's one that has been decided by the Supreme Court in Baker versus Carr, which is that the expectation is that districts be of approximately equal size. Obviously, it's based on a census. That census happens once every 10 years, and by the time the districts are actually formed, we know that the population has shifted a little bit, but nonetheless, the idea is to have as equal as possible. A second important quality, and this is in the current Pennsylvania Constitution, is compactness. And compactness is the idea that you don't want to draw districts that have very strange lines. And so there are actually quantitative measures of compactness. The Voting Rights Act also provided another important criteria, and that is representation for underrepresented groups. And so considering, for example, the African American population and the Hispanic population and their ability to actually seek representation is important. Contiguity is another criteria that is important in the redistricting process. Contiguity is the sense that you can't have a district where one piece is in the west of Pennsylvania and one is in the east, that somehow districts should be connected to one another. And what that connected means has been part of the discussion or some of the things that we've heard at the hearing. A really important one that has come up in the public hearings has been the degree to which they split political jurisdictions. So in the public hearings for the commission, we've heard a lot from individuals who live in school districts or cities or counties that have been split quite a lot by districts, and so that also is a consideration. And then communities of interest is also important, and that's the idea that regardless of the political jurisdictions, there are sometimes communities that share the same interest, and they should, as much as possible, be represented by the same individual. So a good example is we had one individual in the public hearing who lives along the Susquehanna River talk about how that is a community of interest in some sense.
So those are a lot of factors to consider.
Yes,
You mentioned the public hearings earlier. Can you talk about some of the ways that your commission went about hearing from the public what matters to them and what they think about the redistricting process?
Sure. Well, so our commission was mandated with holding 6 public hearings. There was a website where individuals could both answer questions and provide written statements if they wanted to, upload documents. We also ran an online survey that people could provide feedback on. And we also tried to reach out extensively to different populations to make sure that we were really hearing all voices.
Did what you hear differ based on where in the state you were? You know, Philadelphia and Williamsport, for example, are very different places.
Right. Well, and so I went to 4 hearings in Williamsport, Altoona, Pittsburgh, and then Philly and Harrisburg. I guess I went to 5. And yes, there were some differences, but there was also a lot of agreement across the state in terms of what people were concerned about as they were talking to us. So we would bring them up in small groups. We didn't. Many public hearings are people just read statements, but we actually asked people just to come sit at the table with us and talk and let us ask them questions. And so it was a little more conversational than the usual kind of public statement. Uniformly, people were concerned about the way the redistricting process affected the way democracy works in Pennsylvania. That is, they were concerned that the current redistricting process created difficulties for voters, created difficulties for candidates, and really depressed both turnout but also increased the mistrust of the legislature over the long term. So we heard a lot of those sorts of statements from people who engaged us in the public hearings.
So they felt that because they had heard that the state had been gerrymandered, that led to increased distrust in the legislature?
I think the increased mistrust, it was of the electoral process more than specifically at the legislature. I think people have a connection with their personal legislator. And so I don't think that it's necessarily I mistrust the person who's elected in my district. But I think many people talked about the fact that because of a lack of transparency, because of a process that really didn't include citizens' voices, and because of a process that seemed to draw districts that didn't kind of follow basic principles that they believed were kind of fundamental, that individuals talked about the system being rigged. A lot of them talked about incumbents determining their own reelection process. So you heard a lot of mistrust of incumbents particularly, although I think if we had pressed those people more and more, many of them have connections to their individual representative, but I think there was a sense that the incumbents were determining their own reelection, and that was not democratic, or a word we heard a lot was fair. So I think all of that kind of led to an increased mistrust or distrust of the process.
There are several states that do things very differently. I know places like Arizona and California are often pointed to as models for different ways that maps can be drawn. Can you tell us what the processes there look like, and whether you think something like that might be viable in Pennsylvania?
I think to kind of give the general overview, first of all, most states do have their maps drawn by the General Assembly, but increasingly across the country and in multiple states, there are these kind of push for a different sort of process. And I think the basis of that push is the idea that there should be some sort of commission separate from the legislature that determines the maps. In many cases, when we talk about determining maps, there are different parts in the process that a commission can play. One is that they can draw the maps and then they're approved by the legislature, and that's one process you do see in different states. Another is that some sort of independent commission creates the entire process.
In states like Arizona and these places that have the independent commissions, do we see any evidence there that this approach produces a fairer map than one drawn by the legislature?
I think you do see people talking about the process as being somewhat more fair, and people really, and I should say this is just generally from having read media. I have no concrete evidence of that. There seems to be more acceptance of the process. But I should say it's not universal. So there are people who will argue that the California process is also tainted by partisanship.
Yeah, and I was actually going to ask about the kind of citizen jury model. So in deliberative democracy circles, that's talked about as a way to bring more people into the process, take partisanship out of it. Do you see opportunities to maybe bring a more deliberative approach to the redistricting process?
I do. Let's say I'm a hopeful person, and I do believe that you can bring more deliberation to the process. I also think with the increased transparency that an independent commission can bring, that also moderates the voices that are involved in the process. And so I think that's another aspect that is really important. That is, you can, even though our party system at the state level and at the national level is very polarized at the moment, that by making the process transparent, that reduces some of that party polarization that occurs.
Yeah, and speaking of transparency and polarization, did you hear any differences at the public hearings or through other feedback that you've collected on the commission about differences in how Republicans and Democrats perceived the redistricting processes or gerrymandering, things like that?
There were a few differences, but what amazed me was the degree to which there was uniformity. And we reached out to some Republican, particularly towards the Republican side, multiple times. So among the ordinary citizens, there was general agreement that the process was problematic, although they might see different parts of the process as problematic, but that the process currently going on is problematic. And secondly, there was uniform support for the idea of an independent commission somewhere in that process. Mm-hmm. So I think the uniformity there was really one of the things that amazed me. I had expected much more polarization, so much more support among Republican citizens, for example, for the current process, and I didn't see that at all. Now, there are different parts of the process that people have concerns about, so I do think there are Republicans who had concern about the most recent redistricting by the PA Supreme Court. I think they saw that as problematic, right? But in terms of creating a normal process by which redistricting could occur. I think there was actually quite a lot of agreement that having an independent commission somewhere in that process would be good.
Mm-hmm. How is the degree to which natural sorting occurs, how does that impact redistricting and how the commission is approaching the issue?
So I think among all parties, urban, rural, Republican, Democrat, what you heard was a sense that you wanted a process that was fair, that represented the voices, that the kind of diversity of voices across the state of Pennsylvania. Some interesting things. So there were a few Democrats who came from overwhelmingly rural Republican districts who said, I recognize I'm very different from the rest of my community, and that I am not going to be represented, or at least my party is not going to be represented by whoever is elected in my district. But that's okay because that's the democratic process.
So you spent your career as a political scientist. Did getting out and going to these hearings, doing surveys, did you learn anything that changed how you perceive redistricting or things related to it?
I think some of the things that I had thought about were kind of reinforced by my participation in the process. But it also, it is something to hear very specific people come up and say, here's the problem I face. I'm represented by a district that's 120, 200 miles long. My representative doesn't have an office within 100 miles of me. So if I want to go and talk to him, I have to travel for a couple of hours. Or to hear candidates say that they found it very difficult to run for these offices because the costs of being a candidate and traveling across 2 or 3 other districts to get to remote parts of a particular district really made it more difficult to participate in the democratic process. Or the 17-year-old who said, I'm really politically active, but me and my fellow high school students can never figure out who represents who because our district is split by 2 or 3 congressional candidates. And so we're just we don't want to talk about it because we're afraid of, looking stupid if we say we're represented by the wrong person, right? So, the ways, just the concrete ways that these sorts of districts can play out in terms of how democracy works were really, really dramatic, I think.
Thinking about the various criteria we were talking about before, compactness, keeping communities of interest together, et cetera, those things sometimes conflict. So how do you prioritize, or how do you determine which has more weight in places where they are at odds with each other?
Well, the interesting thing is you can draw an amazingly infinite amount of maps if you were just free of any criteria, right? For the people listening to the podcast who are interested in this, I recommend going to Draw the Lines PA and trying to make a map. That's one of the very first things I did. It is not as easy as it seems, but it gives you a sense of where that wiggle room is and how to think about it. Right. And you can draw as many as you like. And so you can get a sense of what it's like to try and use those types of criteria.
Yeah. And it would be interesting to listeners out there to see how someone from within Pennsylvania draws the map versus someone from outside Pennsylvania.
Right.
There's a different perspective there.
Right.
So going back to the public hearings, you mentioned that they you deliberately chose to have people come up and talk with you as opposed to reading a prepared statement. Can you just talk a little bit more about why you went with that approach and how you think maybe the results differed as opposed to just having people read statements?
So rather, we asked people to join us at the table and kind of urged them to talk just really briefly. And then we asked a lot of questions. And the one positive thing about that, I think, was it was conversational. It allowed us to explore some of the concerns that individuals had more deeply. I do think some of the most interesting comments came when, we asked, okay, so could you say concretely what exactly is the effect of this on this? It made, I think, the hearings maybe a little bit longer in that sense. But I think in terms of learning something, I think it really allowed us to engage in dialogue with people who were really concerned about the process.
Mm-hmm. Is there an example that sticks out to you of someone who there was like a really good dialogue, or maybe you found you learned a lot from in particular through the course of that questioning process?
There are some that stick out more than others. For me, and I'm very bad with names, so I won't remember her name, but the very last person who spoke at, I think it was in Philadelphia, it could have been Harrisburg, was an older woman who talked about, her perspective over the years watching how Pennsylvania politics has changed and how concerned she was and this really only came out after she had kind of said, well, this is my concern, how concerned she was, not so much for herself, she was 90, right, but for her grandkids. And sometimes it was also just understanding a little bit more what the actual effects were of the current process on people.
Leanne, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
All right, so we're back, Chris and Michael.
I'm certainly glad Leanne is on that commission.
Yeah, it is an interesting thing in a lot of ways, and extremely timely given where we are as a nation. And I do think that when I've been out, there's a fairly universal sense that gerrymandering is going on, and that there's something fundamentally undemocratic about it. And I also was struck by something that she said, that she was struck by how uniform this demand on the part of citizens was for fairness, that irrespective of party, irrespective of rural, urban, there was this universal desire for elections that reflect the will of the electorate, right? Now, I'm certain that how these people are going to define fairness is going to differ significantly, but that's what politics is about, right? But the idea that we start with the objective, universal objective of making elections fair in terms of how they represent the will of the people, I think is kind of edifying.
What is it so? Are you going to, as the courts have required, recognize problems of minority disenfranchisement?
Right.
Okay, so if you're going to do that and create districts where minorities will have representation, then maybe you're putting at risk somebody else's notion of what's fair.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I actually am, one of those who says that it's, there's a lot of ways to make a fair map, depending on how your values line up.
But people do have this notion, clearly, and we've been seeing this build up, I think, for years in American politics, that the current way of redistricting is not fair because of this idea. And I think this is one thing I take away from what they were doing that's really quite important. I think the fundamental reason people think it's not fair is this notion that politicians or elected officials are picking their own voters.
Instead of voters picking politicians.
Yes.
I think, and she says that.
Yeah.
And I think that's right.
And so, I think the fundamental issue of fairness comes in by who draws the maps, not necessarily by what the maps look at. And I know that they were considering this because, among the materials in the commission and discussions that they had to do with what other states are doing, states that have nonpartisan commissions or something like that, to develop these maps and that take them out of the hands of politicians. And so I think the fairness comes in on how the map is drawn, not the result of the map.
That's fair. And I also think that for citizens, that might just be sufficient in a number of ways, right? Their concern is that they don't think it's fair right now, and they want their demands to be responded to. So irrespective of how competitive the new map is or isn't, I think the idea that you end up with a process that they judge to be more fair and you respond to their demands improves their attitudes about democracy.
One of the things you run into with redistricting, partly in the way that the populations are sorted now, especially in terms of partisan identifications, is that it's inevitable. You can't not create democratic maps. It would be almost impossible to completely break up Philadelphia such that there were no Democratic seats.
Right. No, I agree with that. I mean, this is kind of the big sword argument, that there are dimensions of district drawing that are just inevitably going to end up with seats that are preponderantly one party or another.
Especially if you're trying at all to retain political jurisdictions, if you are required to be compact.
Yeah.
Especially compactness, actually, I would think makes it almost impossible with how Democrats live in cities and Republicans don't.
Right. Yeah, so I think people have an inordinate hope associated with taking this out of the legislature, that, elections are going to suddenly become significantly more competitive. And there may be there probably will be some more seats that way. But, if you're talking about rural Pennsylvania, it's going to be decidedly Republican. If you're talking about the city of Philadelphia, it's going to be decidedly Democrat.
Well, and this gets into the question of whether seats should be competitive or not, because seats in Philadelphia should be Democratic and seats in rural Pennsylvania should be Republican, since that's the politics of those populations.
Right. And you would have to undermine a lot of the other values that people take seriously in drawing maps if that was your primary consideration. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. And so, but again, I think that if that this is clearly something that people throughout the state are unhappy with.
Yeah, there is a sense that this is an area of politics that has gone unremarked upon in many ways by the public in a while, but that seems to be changing over the last 5-10 years.
They don't like it. Yeah, and with the...
I think it's a consequence of the 2010 redistricting.
I think, you think the Republicans
which is so
just
outrageous.
overplayed their hand.
Well, it depends how you say overplayed, because had the Supreme Court come back with a different decision, then you would have said they overplayed their hand.
Yeah, that's true.
But actually, given how the decision came out, one would have to say they played their hand magnificently.
Well, fair, but if they had made them, drawn maps that weren't shaved down to the level of one side of the block versus the other side of the block, and if they had drawn maps that didn't look like Donald Duck kicking Goofy or whatever, I think it may have drawn less attention.
No, I don't think so. Because the key measure for people that are looking at this is, we won, as a Democrat, we won 55% of the vote and we have 40% of the seats. Mm-hmm. That is a fundamental unfairness to us as we look at this. Mm-hmm. And certainly those were the sorts of outcomes on minority representation that led the Supreme Court to require that districts be drawn in such a way that there's more minority representation, because you would have states with, say, 30% minority population and 0 legislative seats, and it was decisions on those kinds of issues that led the courts to say, well, race has to be taken into consideration. You have to create majority minority districts. Mm-hmm. But to bring it back to where we are, the significance of the decision is it's definitely the states.
Right.
You want to deal with redistricting, you don't like your maps, you're going to have to take it up
and
at
it's
the
worth
level.
noting that they picked, that the advocates picked Pennsylvania because there were standards in the state constitution.
Right. Well,
and if your state constitution doesn't have that, it's going to be harder for you to do it.
Yeah,
but
it's
in any case, you pick your battles where you got a chance to win, as Sun Tzu said. The decision of the commission, the commission's report is going to come out, I think, in September. So it'll be shortly after this is, out. And as soon as it does come out, we'll link to it. And in the meantime, we'll link to the Committee of 70 and other cool stuff about gerrymandering.
All right.
Sounds good. So thanks to Leanne for giving up her time, and that's true for all the commissioners. And it is kind of edifying to hear her good report on the citizens who took part in it as citizens.
Yeah,
And-
let's give it the value that it deserves, because there's a lot of complaint these days about elected officials, and so here's
and about public hearings.
and yes, and
right?
and here's a group of people that are determined to try to do the best thing for the state and have given up a lot of their time and are giving the public an opportunity to
genuinely
have input
yeah,
into an important
to convey
decision.
their views as opposed to
to
just
convey their
rant for
views
2
and
minutes.
to learn. Because
To
I think
discuss.
part of the roles of commissions here is we were talking a couple weeks ago, I don't know where this is in terms of the podcast schedule, but about this notion of democratic pedagogy. And here's another example of where, a commission like this can help to explain to people
Right.
why decisions made the way that
and
they're
to
made.
model a certain kind of behavior, right? So thanks to Leanne and to all the folks on the commission. Thank you to all of you for listening. I'm Chris Beam,
I'm Michael Berkman.
and this has been Democracy Works.